Moving into a new neighborhood, I braced for trash day debates and awkward neighbor hellos. What I got? A self-appointed dictator named Karen. From day one, she declared war, notes about my lawn, fines for too bright porch lights, warnings for bins an inch out of place. But when I opened an eviction notice from her, that's when I realized Karen had no idea who she was messing with. And the reason? Let's just say I held a secret she never saw coming. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I expected the usual growing pains, adjusting to a new place, getting to know the neighbors, learning the unwritten rules of the community, figuring out which day trash pickup happened. What I didn't expect was a self-appointed dictator named Karen, who seemed to think she had final say over everyone's lives. From the moment I moved in, it was clear she had a personal vendetta against me, though I had no idea why. Maybe she didn't like new homeowners who didn't bow to her self-imposed authority. Maybe she had too much time on her hands. Or maybe, just maybe, she'd been waiting for someone to challenge her reign for years, and I had unknowingly become that person. It started small, passive-aggressive notes about my lawn not being trimmed to neighborhood standards, complaints about my trash bins being an inch too far from the curb, and even a ridiculous warning about my porch light being too bright at night. Every week, there seemed to be a new complaint, a new infraction I was supposedly guilty of. Every week, a new complaint. I felt smaller, angrier, till that letter changed everything. But I played along at first, humoring the rules, trimming the lawn, adjusting the bins, dimming the porch light. None of it made a difference because things escalated quickly. When Karen, in all her righteousness, decided that I didn't belong in the neighborhood at all, it hit hard. It was a Tuesday morning when I checked my mail and saw an official-looking envelope stamped with the HOA logo. I opened it expecting yet another petty fine or absurd rule update. Instead, I found something even more ridiculous, an eviction notice. My hands shook as I read it. Foreclosure? No, this couldn't be real. But then, I remembered. The house Karen lived in? I owned it. And she was just a tenant. The letter was written in Karen's usual condescending tone. Dear homeowner, after careful review, the HOA has determined that your property does not align with the established guidelines and aesthetic values of our community. Due to multiple infractions and ongoing disputes, we have initiated the process to have you removed from the premises. You have 30 days to vacate the property or face legal action. I blinked, then blinked again. I owned my house outright. There was no possible way the HOA had the authority to evict me. Yet here it was printed in black and white. That's when the final line caught my eye. Failure to comply may result in foreclosure proceedings. My mind raced. Foreclosure? They couldn't just remove someone from their own home, but they could, in theory, find ways to financially pressure them into leaving. The problem? That tactic wouldn't work on me. Karen, in all her arrogance, didn't know that I owned the very house she was living in. Karen wasn't just my overbearing HOA neighbor. She was a renter. And through a series of investment purchases I'd made years ago, I was her landlord. I chuckled, shaking my head at the absurdity of it all. She had no idea that the eviction notice she sent me, I could easily turn around and send right back to her. I sat down at my desk, pulling up my property management files. There it was, clear as day, Karen's lease agreement, signed and dated, with my name right at the top as the property owner. I skimmed through the document, making sure there were no loopholes or details I'd forgotten. Nope, everything was airtight. Karen wasn't just some overzealous HOA president, she was my tenant. And by the terms of her lease agreement, she was in direct violation of multiple clauses. Harassment of other residents, check. Unauthorized alterations to the property like the ridiculous HOA signs she'd installed on the front lawn, check. Attempting to interfere with legal property ownership, oh, big check. Karen's smirk dissolved as she read the first line. Termination of lease. This is a joke, she spat. I leaned in, cold and calm. The joke's on you. This house? It's mine. That afternoon, I took a slow walk toward Karen's house, the one I owned. She was outside as usual, nitpicking at some poor neighbor about their garden fence being half an inch too high. She turned when she saw me, her expression immediately shifting into a smug, rehearsed look of superiority. I assume you got the notice, she said, folding her arms. It's nothing personal, but the HOA has made its decision. You don't fit the community standards, and we can't have that. I took a deep breath, savoring the moment. Oh, I got the notice, I said, reaching into my folder. And I have a response. I handed her the papers, watching as her eyes skimmed over the words. It took a moment before realization hit, and when it did, her face went pale. This, "This is a joke, right?" she stammered. "You can't do this. You don't have the authority." "Oh, but I do," I interrupted, smiling. "See, Karen, the house you're renting? It belongs to me. You sent an eviction notice for a property I own, while failing to realize that you've been living in a property that I've had the legal power to evict you from this entire time. Funny how that works, huh?" Her hands shook as she clutched the papers, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She had no comeback, no excuse, no legal loophole that could save her. "You wouldn't dare," she finally whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I tilted my head, feigning thoughtfulness. "Maybe not, but that depends on how you want to proceed from here. Because I'm done playing games. You're either stepping down from your little HOA throne, or you're stepping out of my house. Either way, Karen, your reign is over." Her face burned red, jaw clenched so tightly I thought she might crack a tooth, but I didn't wait for a response. I simply turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, holding her own eviction notice in trembling hands. Karen refused to believe that I could legally evict her, despite the fact that I had just handed her the official termination of her lease in black and white. I could see it in her eyes. She was scrambling for an angle, some technicality, some rule she could twist to avoid the reality of the situation. But the law wasn't on her side, and she had no idea just how airtight my case against her really was. The next morning, I received an email from the HOA. I didn't even have to open it to know exactly who was behind it. The subject line read, "Illegal eviction notice, violation of HOA bylaws." I sighed, already preparing myself for whatever nonsense Karen had cooked up. When I opened the email, I nearly laughed out loud. "Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that you have engaged in unauthorized eviction proceedings against a resident of our community. The HOA has strict rules against retaliatory actions and unlawful displacement of residents. Any attempts to remove a member of this community without due process will result in immediate fines and further legal action. Please consider this your official warning. Sincerely, HOA Compliance Team." Oh, this was rich. I almost had to admire her audacity. Karen was clearly trying to use the HOA's authority to protect herself, but what she failed to realize was that HOA rules don't override state landlord-tenant laws. I wasn't kicking her out because I didn't like her. I was evicting a tenant who had breached the terms of her lease, plain and simple. Still, I wasn't about to let this nonsense slide. If Karen wanted to play games, I'd play right back. I drafted a response that was about as professional as I could manage, while still letting my irritation show. "Dear HOA Compliance Team, thank you for your message. I appreciate your concern regarding unlawful evictions. However, Karen is not a resident of the community in the sense you describe. She is my tenant. As the legal owner of her property, I have the right to terminate her lease for cause, which I have already done in accordance with state and federal housing laws. My decision is not subject to HOA oversight. Furthermore, any attempts by the HOA to interfere with lawful landlord-tenant matters could be considered harassment, for which I am prepared to take legal action if necessary. Best regards, your favorite landlord." I hit send and sat back in my chair, satisfied. Karen could try to weaponize the HOA all she wanted, but it wouldn't change the fact that she was out of moves, or so I thought. Later that afternoon, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, 2 police officers were standing on my porch. I immediately knew why they were there. "Sir, we need to speak with you regarding a complaint," one of them said. I sighed, already exhausted by the sheer pettiness of the situation. "Let me guess," I said. "Karen called you." The officers exchanged a glance. "She did. She claims you're attempting an unlawful eviction and that you're using intimidation tactics. We just need to ask a few questions." I nodded, stepping aside to let them in. "Come on in, officers. I have plenty to show you." I pulled up every document, Karen's lease agreement, the termination notice, the multiple violations of the lease terms. I even showed them the email from the HOA and my response. The officers read through everything carefully before one of them sighed and looked at his partner. "This is completely legal," he muttered. The other officer nodded before turning back to me. "Sorry about this, sir. Happens more often than you'd think. Some people don't understand that HOA rules don't override property ownership." I let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, I'm getting that impression." They left soon after, but not before one of them knocked on Karen's door. I didn't hear the full conversation, but I caught the tail end of it as one officer firmly told her, "Ma'am, this is a civil issue, not a police matter. Don't call us again, unless there's a real emergency." That was the first crack in Karen's armor, but it wouldn't be the last. Because next, I filed a formal legal notice with the court to move forward with her eviction. Once that paperwork was in motion, there was no stopping it. I gave her 30 days to leave per the lease agreement, but I already knew she wasn't going to go quietly, and I was more than ready for whatever ridiculous stunt she was about to pull next. Eviction day had arrived, and despite everything, Karen still hadn't packed a single box. She had spent the past 30 days throwing every desperate move she could think of to stall the inevitable. She had filed a bogus harassment complaint against me, which was immediately dismissed when I showed the police full documentation. She had tried to get the HOA to intervene again, only to be met with silence after they realized they had no authority over a private landlord-tenant dispute. Now, standing on her front porch, my property, she had nothing left but pure seething rage. The sheriff's department arrived right on time. 2 uniformed officers stepped out of their car, clipboard in hand, and walked up to Karen's door. I stood across the street, arms crossed, watching as she opened it. She tried to keep her composure at first, but I saw the way her face twitched when she realized what was happening. This was real. There was no more stalling, no technicalities. She was out. "Ma'am," one of the officers began, his voice firm, "we're here to execute a court-ordered eviction. You have 15 minutes to vacate the premises. Any remaining belongings will be removed by a locksmith and cleanup crew." Karen's face twisted in outrage. "This is my home. You can't just—" The officer didn't flinch. "No, ma'am, this is his home," he said, pointing directly at me. "You were given 30 days' notice and multiple legal warnings. You are now trespassing on private property. If you do not comply, we will have no choice but to place you under arrest." That got her attention. Karen, the almighty HOA enforcer, was now the one violating the law. She turned to me, desperation creeping into her voice. "You don't have to do this," she hissed. "We can work something out. I can drop the complaints." "I can." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, now you want to negotiate? After trying to have me kicked out of my own home, after dragging me through bogus fines, police calls, and HOA nonsense? No, Karen. You made your bed. Time to lie in it." Her expression crumbled into pure disbelief. For the first time, she realized she had lost. She stomped back inside, and for a brief moment, I thought she might actually comply. But then, through the open door, I heard a crash. "Ma'am, step away from the property," one of the officers shouted, moving toward the house. Karen had lost it. She was knocking things over, throwing picture frames, screaming obscenities. She kicked a chair over, sending it skidding across the floor, and started yanking drawers open like a deranged raccoon. I sighed. She's really going out like this, huh? One of the officers turned to me. "Would you like to press charges for property damage?" I considered it. Oh, how tempting it was. But no, I didn't need to drag this out any longer. "Not unless she breaks something major," I said. "I just want her out." 15 minutes later, Karen stomped down the steps of my house, dragging a single suitcase behind her. She glared at me, face red with humiliation. She opened her mouth as if she was about to say something. One last insult, a final pathetic attempt to regain some dignity, but nothing came, because there was nothing left to say. She turned, got into her car, and sped off without another word. The officer secured the house, changing the locks, as I signed off on the final paperwork. It was over. Karen, the nightmare of the neighborhood, self-appointed queen of the HOA, was finally gone. I stood on my front porch, taking in the peaceful silence. No more bogus fines, no more threats, no more battles over community standards. And just to drive the final nail in the coffin, the very next day, I received an email from the HOA. "Dear homeowner, due to recent vacancies, there is now an open seat on the HOA board. As a valued member of the community, we would like to extend an invitation for you to apply." I laughed out loud. Karen's house was empty, the neighborhood was quiet, and now they wanted me to take her place. I closed the email and went about my day, knowing full well that I was never going to join the corrupt board. But watching Karen wherever she was, miserable, knowing she had lost everything, priceless. The neighborhood fell silent. No fines, no Karen, just the sweet sound of karma.